that in the chat
Yep.
that he can only see Michael. I think you have the same problem as I had because none of the videos appeared either.
Right. Yeah,
I think you have to be promoted by Michael.
Yep. That's probably what you see until you get promoted. So welcome for the viewers. Welcome to the Diagnostics Working Group meeting for July 11th, 2018. We have our standard agenda. So are there any announcements that people would like to make before we get started? Okay, if there's no announcements, we might as well move on to the agenda. I guess before we jump into the agenda, is there anything that people want to add to the agenda that's listed there? No? Okay, so first thing on the agenda is informal diagnostic meetup around Node Summit. I don't think there's anything more to discuss on that front. Let me just open the issue to see if there's anything that's been added recently. Yeah, I think it's just, a few people have said when they might be able to make it to get together, and if people get together, that'd be good. I'm suggesting, unless anybody objects, we should just take that off the agenda. Okay, so let's just gonna take a note. Nothing new, remove from agenda. Okay, so the next item is Diagnostic Working Group Deep Dive topics. This is 168. I think this is just as a reminder to us all that we wanted to do some of those. So I think Matthias had proposed an agenda a little while back for the deep dive into meeting expectation on tier supports. That's one actually, I think I did put together a brief overview. And yeah, so this is a starting point. So I thought we'd spend some time talking about that. So let's dive into that. This is the issue, but maybe it makes more sense if I try and share my screen. So let's do that. Share screen. Hopefully I'll get the right one. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that now.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to bring up participants again, just in case somebody else joins. Where's that? Okay, so we're good. So this is basically just the starting point of what I put together. I tried to make a definition of a couple of tiers, so maybe we can walk through those tiers, see if we think they make sense or tweak them, that kind of stuff. Tier 1 is basically, it's critical to the ecosystem, must always be working for all current and LTS node releases. Release will not be shipped if the test suite for the tool is not green. For a tool to be considered for inclusion in this tier, it must have a good test suite, and that test suite and a job must exist in the node CI so that it can be run as part of the release process. So no commit to master should break this tool if the next release is within 1 month. So an example of one that might already be in that kind of category based on the testing we have, I think, is the debugger command line interface, since we ship it as part of Node. I think there could be others that we might want to get to that level, but there's certainly nothing else that's probably already there, or a lot of them are not there anyway.
What we could do is to just put all of them to tier 4 and then gradually sort of promote them.
Absolutely, that's what I thought. That's what I did in the diagram.
Mm-hmm.
The one tweak I did on that was to put we might go through and agree on what we think the target would be.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, starting at 4, I think you're right. Let's make this list. We'll get there and go through, add everything we can think of to the list, and then we can sort of promote them up through the different tiers. Is exactly what I had in mind. Okay. So maybe I'll just go on to the next one, and at the end, then we can tweak them or something, or if as along the way. So tier 2, I just said, tool is very important to the ecosystem, must be working for all LTS releases. An LTS release will not be shipped if the test suite for the tool is not green. For a tool to be considered for inclusion in this tier, must have a good test suite, and that test suite job must exist in the node CI and can be run as part of the release process. So the real main difference there is that we could break it potentially in the current release, but not in the LTS release. So, right, I don't know what you guys think in terms of like, is that a good distinction between the two? I guess if silence, I'll take silence as like, let's move on to the other ones.
So
and then, sorry,
I think what's actually important here is that tier 1 through 3 all actually require having tests in the first place.
Yep.
And not sure whether that applies to many of the ones that we have in the list.
Mean in terms of like it being what we want to get to, or whether it...
I mean, yeah, we definitely want to get there, right?
Yeah.
But the actual, like what we currently have looks differently.
Agreed. Like we don't... That's why I started them all in 4, is that, yeah, I don't think we've actually got good coverage. And even if we do have some testing, like we don't know well enough if we do or not to be able to say that it could be one of the higher tiers.
Yep.
I guess the key question there is like, do we agree that, that is a minimum requirement for, basically the tiers that we above the bottom one?
I'm thinking of like even Visual Studio Code, Debugger, and DevTools. I mean, they have tests. It just seems unlikely that Node CI would run them.
Right. So, but you're thinking that they should still be able to be one of these other tiers?
Yeah, I think if anything is important, debugging using Visual Studio Code and Chrome DevTools. If that doesn't work, I mean, I think that's the most important diagnostic tool.
Then I would argue we need to run them in our CI, because if we're going to make a release, how do we know if they're there, if they're working or not?
So
what already kind of works is in V8 we have test suites for the inspector and for the debugger at various different levels. And I could imagine that in Node we start adding tests that test the inspector interface just directly without involving DevTools at all.
So there are tests like that already, and I guess the node inspect, the command line tool by Jan is actually is a good proxy there as well. But I guess what I'm really getting at is that, do we need to test DevTools to say debugging is stable?
I think rightfully it's currently broken up into 2 different ones, where the V8 debug protocol is separate from Chrome DevTools, which I think is good. Like the V8 debug protocol, which is the Chrome DevTools protocol, I'm assuming, that one is tier 1 or target tier 1 right now, and the DevTools are tier 3 targeted, which I kind of think that I think that is correct, right? We cannot possibly actually make sure that the latest Chrome release that people are likely to use with the DevTools opening there, that works on all platforms against the DevTools protocol. But we can verify that DevTools protocol is working as far as we can tell from protocol tests.
Right. I don't think it makes sense to test the DevTools UI as well, because that's not something that you can influence. Because it's not Node.js to release that, right? But what you can,
I think it makes sense to. Yeah, but I think that's why the tier 4 is very, very nice, because it allows us to call out, this is a tool that we recommend people be aware of, because we think it's a useful tool for people to be aware of, and we make an effort to make sure that Node is compatible with it. But it's not necessarily something that we verify on release. So the Chrome DevTools UI would be an example of that. That's a useful tool. We think it should work with Node, but we can't really verify it on every release.
Yeah.
So Ali, how does that fit with what you were, like, I think you were commenting on, like, requiring tests for the first couple tiers might cause us to exclude some things that we wouldn't want to.
So I think it does make sense. I'm just trying to square away there's a difference between tiers. So if you look at the definition of the tiers, they talk about how important a tool is to the ecosystem. And I don't think that's, so what I'm concluding is that's not the right way to put it. It's not about how important is it to the ecosystem, because the number of users of Visual Studio Code and Chrome DevTools are significantly higher. And if we break that, like, we have broken the ecosystem, right? People cannot debug. So it's not about importance to being critical to the ecosystem. Like, if it's about what kind of testing Node is going to do on a given platform. That's the only thing that determines a tier.
Right.
Yeah. Setting up some sort of end-to-end tests with Chrome DevTools with Node.js, it's probably going to be hard, because the way DevTools mostly tests its UI is using layout tests. And I imagine running layout tests and at the same time a Node.js instance and then connect them, sounds a little bit tricky.
Right. So I certainly take the point that I think Ali's point is that I've mixed into these definition two things. One is, like, I've tried to rationalize why it would be at tier one, as well as saying what we'll do at tier one, right? So, and the fact that it's critical to the ecosystem doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get it into tier one. So I guess, do these stand alone? We think we just took that part out? If we just took out the first bit, which is the tools critical to ISO, too important, or tools, does it still stand as, or do we need to have something that replaces those?
So I think having some sort of standard for how we test things is pretty important. But they may not directly map to the importance of the tool.
Like, standard way, you mean, is how we would decide whether they can be tier one or should be tier one?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the thing is, some of the tools is important to have, like working as a full end-to-end thing, like Chrome DevTools. But on the other hand, it's kind of hard to test at the same level as, for example, profiling.
Right. But I guess it's that, like, there's the tier one could be, like, just because we don't get Chrome DevTools into tier one doesn't mean that it's not critical to the ecosystem. Right. I guess it's whether, Ali, in your mind, it's whether we should have, like, we're basically saying these things are not important if we make the target tier lower than we'd like it to be if it wasn't for the test consequences, right?
Yeah, I think the tier, from what I'm concluding, is not related to importance at all. It's related to what kind of testing the Node project is going to do before releasing a version, and that's about it. Like, a tier one thing is something we test and we block and release on.
Yeah, and for that, I don't think there should be a distinction between tier two and tier three. If we do have tests, then they should pass, right?
The only difference was that they could not be green for a current versus a release. So
okay.
Right, it's sort of like, when for an LTS release, they have to be green. They all have to be green. It would be that, like, you could say that, like, because current gives you potentially 6 months, you might say land a version of V8 that breaks the tools in the current, but then you've got six months to fix that before you go LTS. But you can't actually go LTS until you fix that in the current. And that was just, I'm not saying that's the right thing, but it was kind of like, one way you could say is that, like, okay, working in current is a little bit less important because we don't necessarily recommend people use current in production, and therefore the tooling is maybe not as critical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was just my rationale. I can easily see that, we could combine those tiers or whatever. So is everybody, like, if I edited this, so to just basically say, tool must always be working Yeah. Does that actually make sense to people?
Mm-hmm.
If there's no objections, I'll update that. Are there any other things that people think we should include in the tiers? Like, this now basically just is, the tiers are strictly like what kind of testing are they going to get and where they have to pass.
Is there any way to, so for example, let's say someone has a pet performance profiling tool, they submit an automated test suite against Node. We tier it as tier 1. Is there anything that makes it anywhere, like, I'm assuming that we could then make a decision for that tool to just say, hey, yes, it has a test suite, but we don't accept it, and then that would make it tier 4, or?
Right. Maybe because we've taken that out of here, like maybe we need like something like the choice of which tier a particular tool will be assigned to is so to see, this is where it could get contentious, right? Like if our group just says, hey, sorry, you can't ship anymore, actually maybe it needs to be a combined decision between the diagnostics work group and release working group. So that will be a decision,
Not only that, we also need some like a criteria, or how do we make decisions, right? So we can, if I contribute a tool, that doesn't make it more important to the ecosystem than maybe somebody who's not part of the working group. So
right.
it'd be good if there was objective criteria.
Right. That's what I was trying to get at in the stuff we just removed, in terms of like it's critical to the ecosystem, or
Yeah, I think that's more related to what we add where.
So what would those criteria be?
Number of users using it. Yeah, and number of users cannot be the only criteria because a tool that enterprises use may not have mass usage.
Right.
Yana, I interrupted you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was trying to get to something like you were saying. I was trying to get something like key enablers, or the availability of alternatives. Like if it's just the only way to get production tracing in Windows, then it's kind of doesn't really matter if it's used by every single person.
Right.
Yeah. So number of users, available alternatives, impact to the overall ecosystem. I think we already talked about, like, we may say, yeah, we'd love it to be in tier 1, but sorry, it's going to be tier 4 because we just can't run the tests, right?
Yeah, and the other thing is not just that whether the tests are available or whether the tests are flaky. So I'm sorry if the tool is important, but your tests just flake out 100% of the time, then we can't have it.
Ability to run the test suite and that and okay, I will just say if the test suite passes consistently, right?
Reliable test suite that can be integrated with our CI.
Okay. Availability of reliable test suite that can be integrated into.
SITGM also have a requirement that there needs to be a person, a contact person that you can like contact and say, hey, something is not working.
Yeah, actually, I like that. So is it actually need to be more than a contact person? Like basically, there's a maintainer willing to support it, like to help resolve issues.
Yeah, actually, I think we should. This should be a superset of the SITGM criteria, right? So that's the criteria we use for third-party testing in our CI.
Yep.
Why not just make it a superset?
Right. So I'm just wondering, like, instead of just like, I would almost say availability of maintainer of or community right? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
So instead, like that's sort of contact person plus, right? It's like you better, we need somebody who's invested enough to say this is important and we need to help get it fixed if it breaks. Are there other ones, if you were looking at the SITGM list, are there other ones there that we should pull in?
Could we reference the SITGM list instead of sort of copying it?
Well, let's just take, let's pull it up and see whether it looks like that makes sense. Okay, I'm looking for that. It's on the main README, is it? Okay, here are the requirements, right. Right, so are these like, is module source being on GitHub a hard requirement? Published versions must include a tag on GitHub. So the first...
Are we supposed to see a new window on your screen?
No, but I can hear, I was just looking at it. Let me share it, new share. Actually, no, instead of doing that, I will just drag that over here. I'll try to drag it over here. Come on, drag in. Okay. There we go. Because I think like the first three main, well, the third one doesn't make sense necessarily. The first two, I'm guessing not necessarily either.
Yeah, I don't know why we would make those a requirement.
So I'm not sure, just referring to that list, I'm looking for any others we might want to pull over.
Yeah, I really like the soft requirements because it's pretty much the same thing that we already wrote up.
So let's see here. Is this the must be actively used by the community? Okay, so it's kind of the heavily dependent on unique portions. I don't think this one applies, right?
I mean, it's basically the ability of alternatives already covered.
Heavily dependent on also in the case of Sitcom means like literally npm dependencies.
Right. Yeah.
In our case, it doesn't mean that. It means dependent on in a different way, obviously.
I mean, some of them would make like we could make these be something like level of like if we so as opposed to criteria, we could recast them as requirements if that's better.
Yeah, it will be hard to come up with hard requirements for example, a number of users, especially since we don't have a good way of measuring it.
Right.
Which is also actually an argument against using it as because it would mean that we would have to come up with a way to actually not only gut feeling, but actually talk about how do we tell how many people are using dtrace.
Right. So I guess it depends if we're worried that somebody will argue that that alone justifies that it needs to be there. Like, because often it'll be like, okay, we just know like lots of people use this, or it's, so you'd say, well, this one qualifies just because lots of people use the Chrome Dev Tools, for example. It's the sort of, and then there's one on the other end where like you can probably look and see, well, yeah, okay, we've never heard of it, so it's probably, small usage. It's the ones in the middle where it might be harder to. Yeah,
so maybe actually rephrasing it as the first one, the module must be actively used by the community, or the tool must be instead of number of users, just there have to be users that we know of.
Okay, so there have to be active users. So there must be. Although, I mean, that one, I would almost say the level of use in the community.
I kind of like the phrasing of that actively used by the community. That's kind of, it doesn't say too much, but it still gives like a feeling of gives the gist of what we're trying to convey, right?
Right. How about this then?
In my opinion, at least.
So as a requirement, it's whether the tool that would be considered, it's like whether the tool is actively used by the community.
Yeah, and also the module fits into a key category brings us to an interesting one of, should we define a scope of the kinds of tools where we say this is something that we are able to add to the release requirements?
In terms of like, you mean the heap profiler, debugger, tracing?
Yeah, so for example, if there's a tool that is a super great checker for licenses, which is clearly not in our scope.
Yep.
Like this is something that we would not be able to add to the release as a blocker, most likely.
Can we just take those types in the left column there and say those are is that a complete list of areas, or?
I don't think it's a complete list, but what are you saying? So like we would take that list and say tracing can't be one and profiling can be, or?
I would just take those categories as a starting point, and if we would need to amend them in the future, just to tell people, hey, this is the kind of tools that we would be able to help with or be able to talk to.
Okay. So this is basically a separate thing. The current.
It's like line 45, right? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically defining a scope of what we are talking
right.
about, what kinds of tools we're talking about.
That we will that fall under this. I don't know what we would call this. Fall under these these tiers are. Now, I don't think it's going to let me easily, but we can do that. And we probably need a bit of a description and so forth, right? Okay, I can pull that over. So any other one of these that we covered off this guy, the heavily dependent, I think we kind of, the unique portion is the availability of alternatives. Okay, and right. So maybe the tool fits into, and now I understand better. We don't necessarily need, although we, as listed, because I don't think it hurts to actually list what those categories are, right? It's a little bit of info. Okay. Do we want to say something about modules? The tool is under the Node Foundation GitHub org?
No, I don't think so. Is that a, like, then other people can't submit anything?
We've just basically said that, you know, yeah, I think we can leave that out in this case. I think in the case of the modules, it was like, if it's one that's under our org, we should likely be testing it. In this case, you know, maybe that's the case for our own tools, but I think we would, I don't know. We could put it, I think the reason it was there is it was sort of like, if you want to say, give tools that are being maintained by the organization an easier way in to just be able to say, well, we're part of the org, that's what it gives us.
Oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, but it still has to fit into like one of these categories, right?
Oh, absolutely, right? Yeah.
But it's not a requirement that, like in the other list from Sitcom, this was like an or like it just had to be one of them.
Right. This is sort of it, but this says some of the criteria to consider might be.
Yes. Okay.
I think this is also a good signal for the stability of tools that we are exposing under Node.js. So the other way around, basically, it's our commitment that if we expose something as hosted under Node.js on GitHub, then we want to make sure that it's actually tested and the tools at least are tier X.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then this last one, the modules identified as an important module. Basically, that's the other out of like, well, we just think it's important. So I don't know if we want to leave an equivalent to that one in or not.
I think by the fact that we are already kind of the owners of deciding whether it gets in or not.
Yeah.
I think if we can't explain using the others why it's important, it might be kind of fishy.
Sounds good. Okay. Okay, so that's good. Anything else like that you see as major thing we should add? Like this will obviously be, you know, I'll convert it to a PR where we can have more discussion, but is there anything else like a major thing that we should have in that first cut? I'll fill in try and put a bit of a description of the categories. And then I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at the ones that were there and like the target tiers that I put them into, just to see if people agree with that or not, because it was just a first cut off the top of my head. I guess that for this discussion, and because I think we only have 20 minutes for the rest of the agenda, it would be mostly like, you know, do we think this is close enough to something we should submit a PR in for, Or are there, like, do we want to schedule some more time to continue discussing it before we do that?
I think pulling in a list early and then iterating on it after it's on GitHub and we can have pull request discussions and people can easier collaborate. I think that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, I will take that as the next step. So we'll just update that. Yeah, so I'll take the action to, I'm going to go back to the minutes. Tier support. We discussed / reviewed the draft. Michael has action to add to create PR. And I guess the one thing we didn't talk about, but just quickly maybe we should, is the do people think that the group that we've got the right group, like it's a collaborative decision between the diagnostic working group and the release working group as to what tier something can be in? Think that's good, bad? I guess nobody violently objects, at least. So we'll leave it like that for now, unless somebody has a suggestion for something else. Okay. So next issue on the list is async hooks stable API tracking issue. I don't know, Ali, if you have an update on that or if anything's going on.
Nothing has been going on in async hooks in the past 2 weeks, so I don't really have an update.
Okay. Do we need to leave that on the agenda, or is it?
I think there's some value for Matteo to keep us updated on what's going on with the PR, with adding a resource to the async hooks API.
Okay. Okay, so I'll leave it on the agenda to get updates from Matteo. So I said, okay. Async context formalization.
Well,
Sorry,
one quick note. I've been playing around with the, I wanted to say this at the beginning, but forgot about it. I've been playing around with the embedder API. And what actually, if anybody's interested, like some feedback on a module I've tried to release with the embedder API. I'm gonna just paste it here. It's for working with the new worker threads. So if anybody wants to look over the code, that would be awesome.
Okay, I will take that from. Can I find the chat?
It's just because we have recently or several times asked if people are using it or in real life and stuff like that. So I thought I might as well give it a go.
Okay, I'm pasting that in here, right? Okay.
Do you have any early thoughts on using it yourself?
It was a bit confusing exactly what to do. I had to look at another module that was using it to figure it out. Yeah, but I mean, once I kind of got the gist of it, I think it was easy. But my problem was still I wasn't really sure if I did it correctly. Yeah, which is also why I wanted feedback on it.
Yeah, so quick glance through looks pretty reasonable, but and I think this is something we should probably be highlighting more, because I think anybody doing pooling themselves, the reason why async resource exists is so that they can actually communicate with async hooks and not break context. So so having example modules to point to. Maybe directly in our docs would be a good thing, and this could be a good module we can point to. And that makes me curious, what was the other module you looked at?
There was Mongo.js, which recently started using it, which is a MongoDB driver.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's using the new experimental worker support?
No, that's using the Embedder API.
Okay, so the Embedder API. So right. Okay, so that's that. This is not related to using workers.
Sorry, I probably misunderstood the question. Original question was the question about how it was to work with the new worker API, or how it was to work with the Embedder API.
Well, my question was, I was just clarifying. Like, this is you're managing a new set of workers that were created with the worker API, like the.
Yeah.
And then it's under async hooks because the Embedder API from async hooks helped you do that.
So that helps me make sure that when you have a pool of workers to correctly pass, make sure that the right context is.
Okay, that the context and everything, okay.
Yeah. So I thought that having a worker pool would be like a nice use case for working with the Embedder API.
Actually,
right.
Does anybody know why it's called the Embedder API? Because I don't see any embedders in this discussion. I don't know why it's called Embedder. It should have a better name.
I think it wasn't once called the Providers API, or is it just my brain that's playing a trick on me?
I think it's, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the history. I think it's just a third-party module connection propagation API or something. Just not for embedders, not necessarily for embedders.
Agreed. It doesn't quite. Yeah. I'm just gonna say.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what Embedder means in this context.
All right. So what was your suggestion, Ali? Again, it was like maybe something like.
I'll think about it. Naming is hard for me, so
Yeah.
I don't have a crisp enough, nice alternative.
Okay, I was just putting in like whatever you'd said, just as like to show that something else might make it come across better. But
yeah, it's an API we give to module authors to do context propagation.
Is it only context propagation? I mean, that's definitely the big use case, of course, but.
I guess we should say async resource propagation, because that's precisely what it does, right? It says, here's a resource, run this thing in this resource.
okay, so maybe think about it a bit more, but I just put that in as minutes for people to think about, and maybe we should make a suggestion on that front. And Ali, since you're sort of leading, you're the champion now for async hooks, I assume you can sort of raise that in whatever format we need to in terms of deciding if we should rename the API.
Yeah, sounds good. It doesn't affect, it's not, yeah, it's just documentation changes.
Yep.
I could probably also, now that I still have this a little bit fresh in my mind, look over the documentation and see if it can probably be improved in a few areas to make it easier for other people to use it.
That is a good idea.
That was one of the hard things for me to figure out exactly how I should implement this.
Yeah, that'd be great, and I think it would be very quite good if you can include some example modules in the documentation, so that's a really good way of people to find out how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so any more discussion on that one before we move on to the next issue? Okay, the next one is async context formalization and diagnostic support. I don't know if there's more for us to discuss today, and especially given that we don't have Mike and we only have 9 minutes left, but I know there's still been sort of discussion going on. Anything people want to talk about right now on that front? No, okay. Discussion continues. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. I thought we skipped that an item, but we didn't do that.
Okay, and then the last item is the trace event tracking issue, number 84.
So James is the champion for that one. There are a few pull requests open. So work continues. There's some shutdown issues that we see occasionally, like if trace events are enabled and processes shut down ungracefully, even bad things happen. And I think there's a pull request from Eugene, but I think he's currently busy. So progress has been slow, but there's some work that's upcoming.
Okay, and the main thing, as I understand, to unlock broader community work maybe is the intrinsic for logging from JavaScript, right?
Yeah, so James was working on a pull request. I think it's there were some test failures that he was looking into. I'm not sure if he's been able to get through those at all.
Okay.
So that's a pull request. That's a CL on the V8 repo.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. Then that's the end of the things that were actually tagged. Now the other one, I think I was talking to Mike Kaufman that we wanted to tag that we didn't. I'll just paste in there. Diagnostics was this one. And then actually I might have one other thing. This guy, which is just, a suggestion that, hey, maybe we should come up with a best practices guide to try and cover, like, for the different sort of problems that people run into, what are the different ways that we should, what tools do we recommend using, and sort of a how-to guide. I don't think we have really time to dive into a lot of discussion, but I think what he wanted was some feedback from this group to say, hey, that's a good idea, or there's some fundamental issues that make it not practical, that kind of thing. So if maybe at this point it's like a call to please take a look at it and comment. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up just before we finish is, and it just reminded me because I see the reader's membership README might need an update. I'm thinking that maybe we need a membership review. We did that in the security working group just by basically sending out an email that says, hey, we're doing a membership review. If you still plan to be active, let us know. If we don't hear from you, you'll be moved to emeritus. If you say you're still going to be active, you still will be. And it was like, we're going to send out an email, wait 2 weeks, send a reminder. And if we haven't heard from anybody after 4 weeks, move them to emeritus. And then I think we even said, if you come back within 2 weeks of that, say, well, wait a sec, I'm still active, we'll just move you back. Does that sound reasonable to people? Something we should do? I just know that, people are talking about, like, hey, we've got 30 people in the working group. And there's probably at least a few we haven't seen for a while. And I bet you if we ask them if they're going to have time, they'll probably say no, right?
I think it's a good practice to, as you suggested, to give people a chance to raise their hand if they still want to be members.
Okay, so if there's no objections, I'll raise an issue just saying, hey, this is what we talked about doing, and as long as then nobody objects in the issue, we'll go ahead and do that. Make sense? Okay, sounds good. That's it, and we have 4 minutes. Anything more? Other things? I guess we can ask if there's questions on the YouTube stream. Let's see. If anybody's watching, they can ask questions. I don't think from what I can tell right now, it tells me one person was watching. And there aren't any comments. So if you are watching and have a comment, you got 30 seconds, and then we'll close out the call.
And there's buffering.
Yeah. Okay, we're probably safe now. So thanks for everybody for showing up. And yeah, I should have mentioned up front, Mike said he couldn't make it today, but he'll obviously be back next time. So talk to you all then.
Bye.
Okay, bye.